Okay, so good afternoon and good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And hello to everyone in YouTube land. I'm Thomas Amadrud. I'm the Associate Professor of English Education here at Nara University of Education, Membership Chair for the Kyoto chapter of JALT, and most importantly, the organizer of today's session on critical realism and applied linguistics. And we're really honored to have with us three top scholars in our field who will show us how and why critical realism is crucial and relevant to research in our field in language teaching and applied linguistics. So to start, we do have a few announcements. First, as I mentioned in the email that everyone received since you've logged in, all attendees at JALT events are bound by the JALT Code of Conduct to ensure a safe and respectful dialogue at all events. So I'll be placing a link to the Code of Conduct in the chat periodically today, just to remind folks. Next, again, this event is being recorded and all of the presenters have agreed to have their presentations recordings posted on our chapter's YouTube channel. So I'll put the link in the chat periodically for the YouTube channel, and I'll be emailing everyone here once they're online so that you can watch them again and add to your no doubt copious notes from today's talk. So if anyone's having connection issues, hopefully that will help you. I would ask that you please mute your microphones during the presentations. Me and the other co-hosts, other Kyoto chapter officers, will be muting people as needed. So just please be aware of that. At the same time, if you're able to, if you have the bandwidth, if you're in a space where you can do it, turn on your cameras. I think a lot of us have presented on Zoom, and by now, you know what it's like to see a blank screen or just unmoving faces or blank names. And it's nice to actually see other people responding to you as you're speaking. So if it's possible, if you can, if you can't, that's fine. If you can, please share your cameras to make this event more together. Now, this event is being held by the Kyoto chapter of JALT, the Japan Association for Language Teaching. JALT is a nationwide organization dedicated to furthering language teaching and language teaching research. And to find out more, please visit jalt.org. Now, if you're not already a member of JALT and you live and work or are connected to Japan, please consider joining. And if you're not a JALT member, we do hope you'll consider a small one-time donation to our chapter. Hosting quality events like this does cost money, and anything you can do can help. We do suggest 1,000 yen, but any amount is appreciated. And I'll put that link in the chat periodically today. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Our first speaker today is Dr. Jérémie Bouchard, followed by Dominic Edsel. Dr. Karen Zotzman is going to be joining us later from the UK, but it's still pretty early right now. So, we're going to let her join us later. And before we start, I do want to say how very grateful I am to the three speakers we have today who are here to talk about this topic. I was saying this earlier before everyone joined us, that when I read critical realism, like, Roy Bhaskar, for instance, I always feel like there's something I'm not getting. And I suspect that other people have felt the same. And so when we were talking about events this year with the other officers, I thought, well, this is a topic that I want to know more about because I don't really feel like I get it. And probably other people feel the same. And I thought, I just happen to know Dominic Edsel, friend, neighbor, colleague of mine. And I also happen to know Jérémie Bouchard. And through you, we were able to get Karen Zotzman in as well. And I really hope that everyone will find this event as enlightening as I will. So without further ado, here is Dr. Jérémie Bouchard. He's a professor in the Faculty of Humanities at Hokkai-Gakuen University, and you're at Sapporo, correct?
That's right. That's right.
Okay. He's a sociolinguist who for the past 10 years, he's been both researching and teaching doing teaching and conducting research guided by critical and social realism and by complex dynamic systems theory. He is also the incoming associate editor of JALT Journal, who I had the great pleasure to work with in producing this JALT Journal's first special issue on race and native speakerism, ELT. Please get it. Thank you. Oh, thanks partially to you. And but that's not why we're here. We're here to learn about sociolinguistics and critical realism. So without further ado, sir, here's Dr. Jérémie Bouchard. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And let me say something very insipid right off the start. You have a very beautiful radio voice, Thomas. So I'm very jealous.
I just got this new mic, so it helps.
Okay, that's good. So thank you very much for everyone to come to this event. I'm really happy that so many members and attendees are here to listen to this conference on critical realism in applied linguistics. This is not an old tendency in the field. This is a rather new tendency. I'm going to, first of all, I would like to thank the Kyoto JALT organization for making this possible. Kyoto JALT is, in my opinion, by far the most active chapter of JALT in the country for many reasons, including your ability and willingness to deal with both very practical sort of contents and more theoretical contents as well, which I think when you think about those two poles, which don't necessarily have to be polarized, this is definitely a chapter which helps contribute to better applied linguistics research in the country. So thank you very much for making this happen. My presentation today will be about the relevance of critical realism to sociolinguistics, but I will make quite a few comments regarding sociolinguistics, which I think are quite pertinent to applied linguistics as well, essentially the study of language in its social context. So let me begin. Let's just see if everything works. Okay, yeah. The content of my presentations there's only two of them. First, I will sort of give a short summary of sociolinguistics or a general description. Then I will try to summarize critical realism as best I can, and try to link it to sociolinguistics research. The content of my presentations are drawn largely from the following book, which I published in 2021. You have the information here. By the way, the slide that I'm using right now, I have uploaded the PDF version of it in the comment box, so you can have it and look at it. My slides are also pretty wordy. There's a lot of language, full sentences and so forth. And I've made it such so that, if you didn't quite pick up a few ideas or a few of the things that I'm going to be talking about, I do tend to speak rather rapidly. Then you can go back to the slides and read the full sentence as opposed to having just keywords, which might actually make things more difficult. So let me begin this conference by asking a very simple question. As sociolinguistics and as sociolinguists and by extension applied linguists, why do we need to bother with philosophical issues such as the importance of critical realism? When we talk about applied linguistics, the term applied tends to kind of limit us or constrain us into believing that anything that we say, any knowledge that we produce has to be of practical consequences. But I mean, I'm not disagreeing necessarily with that principle. My argument, which is not in this slide here, but I do want to say, is that we can't quite have effective practice or an applied field of inquiry without strong theoretical knowledge. And this is very simply because, to be applied, or to have good practice, we need to understand cause-effect relationships. And that is at the level of theory. That is at the level of conceptual thinking, not necessarily at the empirical level. I will develop that argument later in this presentation. So why do we have to bother about philosophy? Well, that's because research is always based on assumptions about our objects of inquiry, the variables in our studies, the data gathering analysis methods and techniques, and what we generally come to think of as valid scientific knowledge. And those assumptions generally fall into one of the school of thought that have been identified by the philosophy of science, for example, empiricism, positivism, interpretivism, social constructionism, realism. We've probably come across those terms in our research and our readings over time, but essentially everything that we do, any sentence that we do, that we propose in our research, can be drawn back to those core assumptions. So it goes without saying then that not being aware of these assumptions can actually lead to problems, can lead to the kind of generation of new problems and the extension of existing problems. And in contrast, if we make those philosophical assumptions explicit, we can not only improve the research that we conduct, but we can also engage more actively at the sort of a transdisciplinary level with other fields such as sociology, anthropology, and health science and law. Let's always remember that applied linguistics and sociolinguistics is not relevant only to language teachers, but for example, healthcare workers need applied linguistics knowledge. People who work in the law, for example, or in the courtrooms and so forth like this. So the field of applied linguistics and social linguistics really is broad, actually. So that's my answer to the question, why should we bother about philosophy? Before I begin with a summary of sociolinguistics, I want to make an important distinction between two terms, which we probably are quite aware of, but I think it's important to remind everybody right at the onset because they're going to come up again in my presentation, in Dominic's presentation, and in Karen's presentation. The difference between ontology and epistemology. Ontology, and you can correct me, by the way, I might have a very simplistic account of it. Ontology is, in my understanding, is that it's reality as it exists regardless of people's ability to understand it. It is beyond our human capacity to understand. In fact, we have, which is epistemology, I'll come back to that later. But when we talk about ontological statements, for example, when we formulate an ontological statement about language learners or about language learning materials, for example, we're essentially talking about the properties and powers of those people, objects, or phenomena. Epistemology includes people's biased, linguistic, cultural, variegated, and constantly evolving understandings of that reality. So that's why we have those two terms, ontology and epistemology. Why is that important? Well, in the context of sociolinguistics, the dominant tendency or approach in the field is interpretivism, prominently coming under the labels of post-structuralism. This has been advocated by such stellar scholars such as Claire Krantz, Monica Heller, Ryuko Kubota, for example, Alastair Pennycook, and the list goes on. And they basically conceptualize sociolinguistics as an epistemic stance, basically. Their idea is that since we don't have direct access to ontology, since we don't have, because of our limitations as human beings, we can't have direct and unmediated access to our objects of inquiries and the world at large, then what we should be focusing on is basically our understandings of it, our epistemologies, and not bother about that other layer. Critical realism distinguishes itself from that view by saying that, or rejects the relativism of post-structuralism by saying that there is reality and there's our understandings of it, and our understandings of it are essentially or inherently geared towards trying to understanding that ontology that we're trying to understand. It's not just a question of understanding what's inside our head, but trying to understand the other, the thing that is beyond our capacity to understand, basically. So from that, basically, sort of a very general introduction of ontology and epistemology and why that's important, let me summarize on sociolinguistics. Many people define sociolinguistics in many different ways. But I think most people would agree that it's the study of the interaction between language and society. I've listed 5 research questions here. I'm not going to read them, but those are the kinds of research questions that sociolinguists would ask themselves as they set about to do their research. The main concern in sociolinguistics, therefore, is the explanation of multiple interacting complex linguistic and social phenomena, making sociolinguistics a truly interdisciplinary field of research. There is a core requirement, however, and the requirement is that we can't depend solely on linguistic theory. We have to rely on theories that relate to both the study of language and of society. So we need to go and listen to what sociologists have to say, what anthropologists have to say, what people working in economics have to say, and so forth. The conclusion is that sociolinguistics, and I don't think that's limited to sociolinguistics, I think that's applied linguistics as well, needs a meta theory. When we talk about theory, usually we are kind of referring to middle range theories, for example, theories about learner motivation or any kind of theories that we're dealing in our research are usually middle range theories. What I'm talking about is a meta theory or a paradigm which can be drawn from existing debates in the field of philosophy and social theory. Why does it need this meta theory? It's basically to frame things together and make everything sort of fit into a rational, logical way of understanding the world. However, in sociolinguistics, not everybody is showing active engagement with social theory. And I'm not the only one to say this. This is kind of a constant refrain in the field. A lot of people have said for quite many years that we should be more theoretically engaged. What does happen by social linguists, what usually they do, they tend to do basically, is to a bit of nitpicking or just borrow concepts here and there from post-structuralism, from realism and so forth. For example, a concept of discourse, identity, fluidity, power, and so forth, and just kind of put this into their research without really unpacking how these relate to the meta theory and how these meta theories sort of connect together or not. And I've read many sociolinguistics papers where these terms are being used quite liberally, and they don't always kind of illuminate the data that people are analyzing necessarily. So they're often used as sort of like flash words or keywords or popular words and so forth. Now, I've kind of advanced a pretty, I wouldn't call it a nasty critique, but that's a pretty trenchant critique of sociolinguistics. I should specify the target of my critique right now. Critical realism criticizes two broad tendencies in the social sciences. One is sort of positivism, or what I would call successionism, and that's more common in, for example, quantitative, statistically based sort of applied linguistics research. I'm not going to focus on that particular part in my research. I am a social linguist. I will focus more on the other target of critical realist critique, which is interpretivism or hermeneutic social linguistics. Well, in my field, it's social linguistic. Critical realism looks at interpretivism or hermeneutics in the social science at large. In social linguistics, this field is basically been advocated by the names in the first point there. I put Ben Rampton's name in green and in bold here because although he has himself associated his work with post-structuralism at times, he has at other times engaged in clearly in critical realist research. And I would recommend strongly his 2006 volume, Language in Late Modernity, which I think is probably one of the best social linguistics research out there. Classic study of high school communication in London school is fantastic. And he navigates between post-structuralism and critical realism at so many times. So his theory is not that rigid, but his analysis is brilliant. Let me go back to that. So basically, interpretivist social linguistics is more common in contemporary social linguistics. And it's often qualitatively oriented, focuses on the interpretation and critique of discourse practices, identity work, and ideologies. And it does prioritize the construction and interpretation of social meaning by individuals in context. Again, it's an epistemic stance. It focuses on people's understanding of reality. It doesn't really focus on ontology. It borrows from the anti-foundationalist philosophies of Nietzsche, Husserl, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger. And these philosophers, they're radically different, but they do kind of connect at one point, which is that they reject any kind of totalizing visions of reality, because their main argument is that we're all human beings. You know, we all have biases, and so even scientists produce bias, sort of socio-historically grounded studies. So because we can't have that pure access, then what we should be focusing on is local narratives. And the basic principle is that reality is what people experience in context and how they understand these experiences. And that is, in a nutshell, that's basically interpretivist sociolinguistics. Now I'm going to lead with a critique of that particular approach. Not that I reject it entirely, but there are some significant problems to note. It tends to overemphasize the value of interview, survey, and narrative data by assuming that people experience structure, social and cultural realities straightforwardly. There is a direct connection between structure and agency, in that their accounts of these experiences are uncluttered by the weight of theoretical deliberation. There's an intrusion of a weird kind of modernist philosophy in there, which is contradictory, actually. This reveals a problematic assumption that identity work is exclusively located at the level of human agency, and that's a principle coming from voluntarism. Whereas, and I think it's quite important to remember that whenever we're talking about identities, we're not talking about what people make them to be, but they are also elements within the cultural systems. They are antecedent resources that people draw from and reject at times. And these are tightly related to social structures and economic conditions as well. Although agents draw from structure and culture in context and for specific purposes, structure and culture cannot be reduced to issues of personal choice and identity. So while interviews, survey, and narrative data can reveal how people perceive, rationalize, and act upon knowledge of structure and culture, it cannot reveal direct insight into structure and culture. For that, we need theory. Also, and this is kind of a tendency that you find in, for example, Alastair Pennycook, the older work by Alastair Pennycook, some of the work by Elena Shohami, Ryuko Kubota hinted in that direction at one point in her work. There tends to be a rejection of the ontological properties of languages, for example, English, Japanese, French, or German, and the standard varieties of those languages. And that, at the heart, is the assumption that meaning does not exist prior to people actually using language. So, for example, that principle says that meaning does not exist in books, dictionaries, and other cultural resources. That argument is a post-structuralist argument that can be drawn all the way to Michel Foucault, but was really advocated by the feminist scholar Weed in 1987. I'm going to skip the last part because basically it's a repetition of the fourth point. Okay, so here's quite a lot of words at you. I've kind of thrown all these concepts at you. I'm just going to kind of release the pressure a little bit and drink a little bit. And if you have any questions to ask me or any points that you disagree with my presentations, here's 5 minutes. I'll yield the floor to anybody to ask. Are there any notions which you think I should develop more, or do you have any comments? Go ahead.
I have a question. Well, yes, not a question, but more like a comment. So I think that your comment that the fact is that there isn't a, like meta theory in applied linguistics in general, I feel like that is too much of a blanket statement. Like, for example, like the more quantitative side, well, particularly when you look at things like corpus linguistics and corpus linguistics researches, which is heavily found, like, I mean, corpus work in general is mainly founded in the ontological, the reality of language as it is itself, right? And it's been that way. And so what you were looking at is actually what you're looking at is the language, the patterns and language itself in corpus linguistics work, right? So I really think you're right in the fact that the way that most teachers and most language teachers, teach in a social constructivist like framework, yes, that I would agree with you completely. But there are notions and there are parts of applied linguistics that lend themselves to critical realism.
Oh, for sure, for sure. But here I would say that in your comment, it's important not to conflate evidence gathered from, corpus linguistics.
Right.
as real. Later on, I will develop that point. There's a difference between the real, the actual, and the empirical. Corpus linguistics reveals quite brilliantly, by the way, empirical language. Language that we can perceive through the senses or through our measuring instrument. In fact, it produced not just the empirical, but also the actual. When I talk about, later on, I'll talk about the real. These are things that are not necessarily perceivable through our senses or through our measuring instruments, but are real things nevertheless, which we need to access through theoretical conceptualizations. So I wouldn't say that they're real necessarily. I would say that they're actual or empirical.
Okay, so what you're saying is that, by theorizing that we're actually creating like real thought rather than just data.
That would be one way to say this. Yeah, data is basically empirical. But we need to understand there's research is essentially, well, it's descriptive and explanatory in the sense that we need to explain what is our data, and the more pressing question, which is, why is my data like this and not otherwise? And that's the task of explanation. And that cannot be revealed directly through, for example, just corpus data or statistical data for that matter.
Okay.
The numbers or the words won't reveal that. You need to think conceptually to get at that level.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Jeremy, we have a question in the chat.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you could see your chat there. From Victoria Thomas. I don't know. I'm assuming that for whatever reason, Victoria can't ask directly, so I'll reading it along. She asked first, can you repeat the name of the book by Rampton, 2006? Yes. And then second, sure. I just want to clarify the meaning of the authors that you critiqued in your last point. Are they saying that language doesn't exist before people use it by reading it in a book, or that it didn't exist before it was produced by a person, i.e. thought or written?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question. First of all, the book by Ben Rampton is called Language in Late Modernity, and you can find it at the end of my slide in the reference list, and I strongly recommend it. It's a fascinating book. I read it twice, and it's just one of my favorite. Basically, what Shohami and Pennycook will say about languages such as Japanese and so forth, essentially what they're attacking is the standard variety, the idea that those languages have a structure and that they dictate how people should talk and things like this. Their main task is basically to say, well, in reality, well, I'm a bit ambivalent about using the word reality because it means, again, many different things: empirical, actual, and real. But empirically, people use language quite differently from the standard variety of a language, and that's a fair point to make. But in making this argument, they are also rejecting standard varieties, and what they're saying is basically, whenever we're talking about languages like English or Japanese and so forth, we're talking about political entities, ideological entities, things that people want to force down our throat for power purposes and everything like this, which is a very, very, very strong argument to make. Not entirely false, but I think that what it does is that it fails to recognize that when people communicate, like I am doing right now, for example, or when your child talks to you over the dinner table, as human beings, we are drawing from existing antecedent and enduring linguistic resources. We don't create language from scratch. And a lot, in fact, corpus linguistics will show quite clearly that our communication is very much communication that has already happened before. We don't have necessarily new conversations all the time. We do tend to kind of repeat the same sentences and the same kind of expressions all the time and everything. And so these things are antecedent, they are enduring, they existed before we were alive, and they will continue existing after we die. And so that argument is missing in the post-structuralist interpretivist sociolinguistics. That's what I meant. Is that okay? Is there any other question?
I just want, and if there isn't another, okay, I'm sorry, we have another one. Could you please tell us the probes essential for language of realism and linguistic conceptualism? Am I reading the question correctly?
Yeah, I don't quite understand that question. Sorry. The probes essential for a language. I'm also seeing that chat with you.
Okay. Dr. Fritz,
I
you might
think
be
she,
good
I think
concept.
she's asking like, what kind of questions do we have to ask in order to understand like languages?
Oh, got you. Thanks a lot. That's a nice interpretation. I will answer that question a little bit later in the presentation. Essentially, what the critical realist question asks, since it is oriented towards ontology, it asks, what is it about reality? What is it about the phenomena that we're studying in our research which makes us reach the type of conclusions we have about them and not other kinds of conclusions? That is the core research question of critical realism. What is it about reality which makes us talk about it in the way we do and not in other ways? Right? So that is a question that orients everybody towards ontology and gets them beyond epistemology. Is that good? Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to keep going, if you don't mind. I will then talk about critical realism. I will list its core features, and as I do that, I will slowly try to link it to sociolinguistics and try to establish its relevance. So critical realism essentially rejects empiricism and positivism. It argues that science is concerned with identifying and explaining causal mechanism. I'll talk a little bit about this, but just to give you a little seed or a little thing to think about, a causal mechanism from a critical realist perspective refers to mechanisms that we can't perceive empirically through our senses or through our measuring instruments, but we know that they exist because of their effects on empirical fact. For example, here's an example: social class distribution. We know that there are poor, middle class, and rich people in society, for example, right? And we know that social class distribution is a mechanism which basically forces people to in one layer and stay in their layers. And it's very difficult for somebody to be poor to then climb up to become rich, right? We know that these mechanisms are at play in society, which kind of makes it quite difficult for people to transcend their economic existence. Some people do, but not everybody, of course. And so, but we can't touch a social class, right? We can't see, okay, social class begins from here to here. We can't measure social class based on salary differentials, for example. That's an insufficient measure. Well, we know that social class distribution exists because we can see its effect on people. And so we've come to theorize about its existence through concept, through theory. And that's the level of the real. That's really what critical realism is interested in understanding. Those things that we can't perceive empirically, but we know that they exist nevertheless. That social class distribution is a very broad thing, but we can have a more local example. Learning, for example. Learning, as simple as that. Learning is a mechanism. We don't know, however, exactly when learning happens. We're all teachers, right? So when we stand in front of students, when we're talking to them, we can, oh, she's learning this and he's learning that. We can't identify that precise moment, right? We also know that learning comes and goes, right? It's in waves and everything, and it takes time, right? But we know that learning must happen because we can see, for example, differences in test scores. We can see that at times people do get things and they get better, right? So learning is what we might call an underlying causal mechanism. I'll come back to that point. It's a very important point in critical realism. It also rejects critical realism also rejects postmodernism, post-structuralism, interpretivism, because it says that there is objective existence beyond discourse, beyond our understanding of the world. It also rejects the sort of statistical sort of dependency on the notion of causal explanations as constant conjunctions. If things happen regularly and everything, then there must be causality involved. And this is quite common in pre-test, post-test studies that we see in applied linguistics. And critical realist thinkers will basically argue that how often something happens says very little about why it happens. When we see something happening quite often, there might be causality involved, but that's not because of the statistical patterns. It's because of a theory about causality that we can explain that particular thing. We can flip it the other way. For example, a tornado or an earthquake happens rather rarely, but when they do happen, it has catastrophic consequences for people, right? So how often something happens says very little about why or its causal potential, right? So these are the things that critical realism rejects in general. However, it embraces three core principles: ontological realism, epistemic relativism, and judgmental rationality. Ontological realism says that the social world is layered or stratified. It gives it ontological depth. And I'll talk later a little bit, two different ways we can understand how reality is stratified. So I said before, the real, the actual, and the empirical. And the other way is structure, culture, and agency. And that's more pertaining to society in itself. Epistemic relativism, basically that argument takes from post-structuralism. It does not reject post-structuralism outright because it agrees with Foucault and Thomas Kuhn, for example, that our views of the world are biased, cultured, language, fallible, and constantly evolving. And it agrees with the notion that no one has direct and unmediated access to reality. That's perfectly acceptable within a critical realist mindset. But it goes further. It says we have judgmental rationality, however. We don't just have beliefs or feelings or experiences as nouns, but these are very much intransitive verbs. We believe something. We have feelings towards something. We have experiences of things. So these sort of subjective experiences, these subjective positions are very much actions or things, and they're oriented towards an other. And so on that basis, we can judge to some extent that some beliefs, feelings, and experiences are better than other feelings. And let me give you a very simple example that I think pretty much everybody will agree. And please forgive me for dramatizing things here, but we can say, for example, that racist beliefs and beliefs about white male hegemony, for example, are not as good as, or they're worse than beliefs about social emancipation, for example. Some people, I'm reading a book, for example, and here's another example. Some people might believe that, only 600 people died in the Holocaust, whereas other people might say, well, no, it's 6 million people who died in the Holocaust. Those two beliefs are not relative to the person who produces them because they can be checked against an objective reality. And we can say, well, that belief is a lot closer to reality than that other belief. So judgmental rationality does not lock people into their own social constructions and how they view the world. It puts them in relation to an objective reality. So critical realist social linguistics, its main objectives is to transcend specifically this epistemic fallacy, or the idea that statements about being can be reduced to or analyzed in terms of statements about knowledge. And this is going, again, contra Claire Cram's view that social linguistics is an epistemic stance. This is really going against interpretivist social linguistics. Although it acknowledges that all forms and approaches to knowledge are fallible, it nevertheless prioritizes judgmental rationality, or the idea that there are rational grounds for preferring one explanation of an objective fact over another. So it's not like objectivism, but it does say that, we can get close to truth if we listen to each other and we are ready to change our minds if we realize that our beliefs are not so good or are not as responsive to the reality that is in front of us. Now, critical realism has this big nugget word, right? Realism. What do we mean by the real? And in response, kind of following from my response earlier, Roy Bhaskar distinguishes between the empirical, the actual, and the real. The empirical is the realm of human perception and experiences. So for example, in social research or applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, this layer is commonly captured through quantitative data analysis, statistical data. and qualitatively through interviews and surveys, for example. These, again, the empirical is what we can perceive through our senses or measuring instruments. The actual, however, includes all the outcomes which did or do happen, as opposed to all those that could have happened but did not. So it encompasses the empirical, but also all the events in the world, whether they are perceived by people or not. For example, I don't think anybody here is living in China right now. So let's just say, for example, a tree that falls in the middle of China right now, none of us would be able to perceive this reality, but it does exist nevertheless. And so that's part of the actual. The level of the real includes everything, but notably causal mechanisms, the things that we cannot really sense empirically through our senses or measuring instruments, but whose existence we can conceptualize through the analysis of empirical data and the use of theory. We know that they are real because we know they have effects on people. So that's the level of the real, and that is the target of critical realist research. Why is this distinction important for social linguists? Because it allows us to accept that individuals and communities are unique at the empirical level. I mean, linguistic diversity is an empirical fact. Nobody disagrees with that. But it does not force us to deny the possibility that important patterns and commonalities also exist at other levels. For example, that there might be a universalist kind of point of contact between people, and that these other points of commonalities also need to be accounted for. This is because structure and agency cannot be reduced to or collapse within each other. With this focus on the real, critical realists can then ask, and this is the question I mentioned before, what are the characteristics and powers of the world or the phenomena that we're researching, which lead us to formulate those particular claims about it and not other claims? Sorry, my cat is hungry right now, so you're going to hear him. So this particular question helps us move beyond our biased viewpoints, what interpretivists will often kind of get entangled with. They will tend to limit their viewpoint to beliefs and feelings and ideas about the world. It helps us move beyond empirical evidence to focus more specifically on the level of the real. It also allows us to look beyond difference or just mere cataloging of diversity to contemplate the possibility for consensus, solidarity, and collective actions for human emancipation. And this is really important because, I mean, for most applied linguists, they might say, well, you know, I'm not that critical, or, you know, applied linguistics research is not particularly critical. I would disagree with that, and especially in the context of social linguistics, I would say that if you are going to study the relationship between language and society, then you are de facto engaged in a critical endeavor because you're trying to understand people's lived experience and their problems and the difficulties that they're facing, and why languages are dying, for example, and why some people don't have the right to information and education in their first language, for example. So that's a critical endeavor. And so if we're going to talk about human emancipation, we need some kind of ontological perspectives which gets us beyond a mere focus on diversity. Let me give you a little bit more example about the empirical, the actual, and the real in relation to language. So how can we understand real language? Well, as a set of underlying generative mechanisms and resources allowing humans to communicate and engage in meaning-making activities, including the emergent properties of language as cultural resources, which both facilitate and constrain situated interactions. And this is precisely what the interpretivist social linguists will reject whenever they reject notions of, you know, a language like English or Japanese. That's not real, they will say. Well, in saying that, they are rejecting the notion of real language. The actual language includes all the linguistic phenomena which do happen, for example, all the dialects and varieties in the world, as opposed to all those that could have happened but did not. Empirical language is very simple. It's what we can get through our senses and measuring instruments, for example, classroom interaction. This stratified view presents language as both a social construction and an entity with intransitive properties. Whenever we say it's a social constructions, the interpretivist will very often assume that it's only transitive. But there's an intransitive layer as well. It emerges from situated interactions to then occupy a position beyond situated interactions, entering dictionaries, for example, and encyclopedias and language classrooms as cultural resources. And it also allows us to understand why, for example, the structure of verb tenses in English is a human construction. There's nothing natural about that. It's a human construction, but it's not alterable by individual effort. Nobody can change the structure of English verbs. It's something that exists. It might change over long periods of times, but it takes a lot of collective efforts to make it happen. Another way that the social world is layered is by understanding it as into three different layers. So agency, structure, and culture. Human agency includes or can be defined as self-consciousness, reflexivity, emotionality, intentionality. It's essentially human beings, us, and our unique powers to do things, and cause change in the world through our discourses, decisions, and actions. Only us have this, only we have this particular power. Structure and culture simply do not have that, basically. Structures, on the other hand, include objective, pre-existing, and enduring sets of social and institutional relations we experience as a result of being in the world. However, structure precedes and survives human involvement. In other words, when I was born, there was all kinds of social structures existing. I basically got connected to those structures, and when I die, they'll keep going without me just fine. So these structure, for example, and culture to some extent, they can cause things to happen, not because they are intentional, because they want it to happen, or because they're reflexive, but rather by providing us with constraining and enabling influences. So for example, we want to do something. I want to learn Spanish, for example. Well, that's my project, right? It's by deciding to learn Spanish, I then engage with structural and cultural constraining and enabling influences. And through that sort of play, I will hopefully master Spanish through my actions. Culture is basically very close to structure, but most critical realists, especially Margaret Archer, will stress the importance of distinguish it from structure, saying that culture is really the ideational realm of human experience, whereas the structure is very much includes the material aspects of social life, and we should not conflate those two. So how do critical realists understand the structure, culture, agency relationships? Well, basically, Carter and New puts it really, really well. People as agents and actors are influenced, although not determined by their structural situations. People choose what they do, but they make their choice from a structurally and culturally generated range of options, which they do not choose. So if we put it in the TESOL context, for example, language learners and teachers can do all kinds of things in the classrooms, like learn a language, do discipline, or, get along, have a party, do all kinds of things, but they do so within structured and cultured contexts. So for example, through language policies, curricula, textbooks, scheduling, learning materials, and even the school building itself, the shape of the classrooms. So critical realist sociolinguistics essentially becomes a study of how agency, structure, and culture as different layers interact over time to produce contingent language learning phenomena. Why is this? I think I'm going to be just a few more minutes before I put everybody into breakout rooms. Why is this layered viewpoint important in sociolinguistics? Well, basically, it gives us a depth ontology. And this depth ontology, my presentation is very conceptual, but later when you listen to Dominic, for example, and you listen to Karen talk about analysis of their empirical data from a critical perspective, you will see that depth ontology unfolding before you. So here are two examples of why this layered viewpoint is important. If you can think of language development, for example, not as a mental process taking place within the minds of individual learners exclusively, but very much as a product of the relationship between people and structure and culture. So as a complex and layered process necessitating biological, cognitive, emotional, reflexive, pedagogical, critical, and social involvement. If we think about, for example, the emergence of a language variety, it's not just about people speaking differently or, speaking in unique fashions in a particular context, but it's rather the result of a complex interaction between specific people's need to communicate in context for specific purposes, how they draw from and resist the standard variety of a larger language variety. It also involves historical and geographical elements, socioeconomic conditions, and other structural and cultural processes. And by accounting for all these layers, we can understand why a particular language variety is the way it is and why it emerged. I'm going to skip those two last points because I think I'm running out of time a little bit. So here's a discussion here. I've outlined sociolinguistics for you. I've summarized the general strokes of critical realism for you. I've explained what a stratified view of the social world is. So what I would like everybody to do in breakout rooms is to identify a particular issue or problem at your workplace which you think needs to be fixed or improved. For example, students' lack of motivation, overemphasis on testing, your students having trouble with academic essay writing, for example, the presence of native speakers, and whatever you deem relevant to your context. And if you were to design a research project, a PhD project, or some kind of paper you want to write, from a critical realist perspective, what different strata or layers or variables would be involved in your research? What might each of these stratum or layer contain, and what methods would be required to study these different layers? So essentially it's about spotting a problem and how you would go about studying it. Okay. All the way up to social structures. And there are many, many different layers, and there are people that are located in these different layers as well. And everybody is differently invested. A teacher wants something that a policymaker doesn't necessarily want, for example. And so these differences across layers are not everybody and not everything is aligned with each other. And so that creates the potential for friction and contradictions. And Margaret Archer would say that in the event, for example, that these things being in friction and in kind of conflict with each other leads to the collapse of a project, then what would happen, what would result from this is somebody's inability, for example, to get a kakenhi or something like that. And so the lack of change is the result. Another possibility is that, there's friction and contradictions across those layers. And then because of a certain combinations of factors, there's actually morphogenesis happening, or the potential for change happening. But again, really to understand change or lack of change in our data, it's really a question of trying to understand what happens at the different layers and how people are differently invested and how processes at different levels unfold differently. And so again, this is all going against interpretivism, basically, that, and just interviewing participants and getting their feelings about their reality is one thing, but it's insufficient data in the sense that people don't see everything. People don't necessarily grasp the theory involved. This is our responsibility as scholars to go beyond what our participants are telling us, basically. Let me move on and basically close my presentation. Here are 8 core tenets of critical realism in relation to social linguistics. So this is a summary of my presentation. First, reality exists somewhat independently from people's understandings of it. Number 2, human understandings, however, are not just pure constructions. They are profoundly conditioned by the structure of objective reality. They are not pure, unrestrained discursive creations. Also, our viewpoints allow us to gain rather reliable insight into objective reality, including the systemic properties of linguistic inequalities. So there's not this kind of hopeless gap between ontology and epistemology. We do kind of align, those two kind of align sometimes and in certain circumstances. Number 3, social linguists should therefore be relative about knowledge, but not about objective reality. That's a really core important concept in CR. Science and scientific progress are possible precisely because scientists are able to recognize the presence of an ontological realm distinct from their understandings of it, and because they're constantly trying to calibrate and sharpen their accounts of it. And that's why we're able to say that science is possible or scientific progress is possible. The focus of social linguistics is consequently ontological rather than epistemological. This allows social linguists to produce scientific knowledge not relative to the group that produces it, but rather knowledge subjected to criticism from multiple directions and research traditions. As I said earlier, the core ontological question guiding critical realist inquiries is, what are the characteristics of reality which lead people, scientists, to formulate the kinds of understandings they have of it? This question leads to a broad range of interrogations about the nature of science, knowledge, discourses, as layered stratified phenomena in themselves, and of course, the ethical nature of science, including sociolinguistics. So a few more points that are important to kind of further distinguish from interpretivism is that social constructions are layered, ontologically stratified phenomena themselves. They possess both transitive and intransitive properties, and they are also profoundly related to objective material realities. This is really what the critical realists are bringing to the interpretivist conversation. As emergent entities, they become cultural structural resources acting as constraining and enabling forces upon human agency. And the 8th point is about critical social linguistics. So while humans can transform their existence in the world to some extent, they can do so mainly through collective agency. A person can adjust his or her speech patterns, for example, in context, but he or she cannot transform a language variety through individual might. And this is because human agency is always profoundly structured and cultured. We're never outside society. I'm going to close here. Just give me 1 or 2 minutes left. This is a very short and rather self-serving list of applied linguistics, sociolinguistic research informed by critical realism. I say critical in parentheses because some of it is complex realism, or other is social realism. So there are varieties of realism. You can see a little synopsis next to them, and you can find these in the reference list at the very end. I also would like to invite everybody to consult the Critical Realism Network on Facebook. It's a fantastic community. People post questions all the time, economists, linguists, sociologists, philosopher, and so forth. And everybody's quite generous, and the top names in critical realism contribute to that network. It's really, really fun. So please try to have a look at it if you can. And here is a list of all the references. Of course, not all these references were cited in my presentations. I've added quite a few so that you can have more to look at if you are more interested in critical realism after this presentation. So thank you very much for everybody. And I will leave the rest to Dominic and Karen, and I really look forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you very much.
So first, everyone, a round of applause for our presenter, Jérémie Bouchard. Thank you very much for such an informative talk. We are a little bit over time, and I know Dominic's ready to go. I'm thinking we could start Dominic's talk at 3:30, if that's okay. Gives everyone a few minutes to take a break. I don't know. I hope so. Michael Hollenbach is here, I believe. Michael and I know each other, so I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning his name personally. If there aren't any questions by anybody else, though, I was actually kind of hoping, because I overheard Michael was relaying some rather critical comments, and he was coming from a very pro-interpretivist stance. And I was kind of hoping that maybe Michael could respond. If you don't feel up to it, I'm fine. That's no worries. And sorry to put you on the spot so suddenly, but
where's Michael?
Hi, I'm here. I don't know
where
I'm.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on critical realism. Haven't done much reading. I know Bhaskar kind of through summaries. But yeah, I would consider myself mostly an interpretivist. And, when I'm thinking about, ontological versus epistemological perspectives and stances, I tend to think that, the idea that we need to find a meta theory, maybe I'll just ask a kind of particular question on that point.
Go ahead.
I guess critical realists would agree that they want some sort of meta theory to be approached, if not fully understood, right? And, in terms of linguistics or teaching or education, as far as I'm aware, there is no meta theory, but that would be true of also other humanitarian approaches like history or economics or, literature.
Yep. Yeah.
The stances, at least as far as I would, what I would believe is that history doesn't have a process, it just kind of happens, right? And the various twists and turns are not because of a theory or because of a, meta processes that's kind of controlling the flow. It just is rather random and, it doesn't have a particular, there's nothing at the wheel, it's just kind of driving itself. So yeah, I know Will raised his eyebrows because we've had discussions like this in the past. But I guess that's a key difference, and it's really a hard difference to bridge or gap because it's a fairly fundamental difference in thinking about the world. So I'm just wondering, how would you? Yeah.
I actually don't think so. I think that's an argument very often made by the constructivists that you're essentially talking about like methodological and theoretical pluralism. That's your main argument, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but you're saying that history evolves the way it is and everything, and diversity is just evident basically, and so we don't need necessarily something that wraps everything around, right? I think critical realists would say that this is fair enough, that you don't want to be dogmatic about critical realism. But there is a point about theoretical and methodological pluralism that needs to be said, which is that it's not necessarily a natural evolution of the sciences, actually. And in fact, it's a bit of an overstatement. What does happen is that people don't necessarily listen to each other, and they go into different niche and areas, and they kind of get along with people who think like them, and that actually creates a situation where debate is nullified. There is no real debate happening between people who disagree with each other like we are doing now, for example, because debate is a face-threatening situation that people don't necessarily want to engage with, and also you want to do your PhD, you want to provide a PhD that's going to pass, right? You want to get a paper that's going to be accepted and everything like this, so you do want to be consistent with your own epistemology and so forth. I completely understand that, but there is, again, regardless of our understandings of reality, whether yours is constructivist or mine is critical realist, there is an objective reality that you and I don't have privileged access to. But it does exist, right? It does exist. It's something that is out there and that keeps on talking to us, and we were trying to understand it, right? So it would be false to say that all sorts of knowledges are relative to the person who produces it. That's a false statement, actually. That's a wrong statement, and that the constructivists will make that point. It overlooks. It forgets what beliefs and knowledge and ideas are really about. They are about other things. They are not just, you don't just have a belief again, or a feeling or an experience or a thought or an understanding. You have an understanding about something. It's always about something else than the believing of it, right? So you and I can have this debate on and on, but that thing that we're talking about kind of looks at us.
I wonder if maybe this is just a difference in the usage of terms, because when I think about objective reality as a concept, I think much more broad than just something more real in terms of what we think about ideology or think about, politics as the real things that we have opinions on. A objective reality to me backs up 3 more levels, in terms of what area or what level we're kind of thinking about influences each other. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining.
That does make sense. There's many layers you're talking about. My understanding of that of objective reality is very simply the reality that exists regardless of anybody's capacity to understand it. It's very general.
Sure.
And yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk, helped me clarify some points on critical realism that I hadn't considered before. So thank you. And I think we can shift over to the next speaker.
Okay, so thank you very much. And again, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the talk. We'll give everyone less than a minute. Dominic, are you ready?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. Give everyone a few more seconds to cool their heels. Jeremy, you can feed your cat. So that's subjective reality. And just to remind everyone, thank you very much for coming. We have a few people who have joined us since Jeremy's talk started. Just to remind you again, this talk is being hosted by Kyoto JALT, so Kyoto chapter of JALT. If you're in Japan, not a member of JALT, I've popped the link for joining JALT in the chat. And if you're not in Japan, you're joining us from anywhere else in the world, that's great. We're happy to have you. If you're able, just to say, we're happy to have this free, but unfortunately, things do cost money, Zoom links, bringing wonderful speakers such as the 3 people you're hearing today. These things cost. And sadly, our Kyoto JALT, just like all parts of JALT, we're a little bit struggling thanks to COVID. And so your donations really would help. We suggest 1,000 yen, which at current exchange rates is a bargain for most people from other parts of the world. Not so good for those of us in Japan, but there we are. Please, again, the link is in the chat. Please donate. Any amount would be appreciated if you're able. So we'll be starting with Dominic's talk in right now.